Jonathan, Jack, Mercer stood alone, the early morning sun casting a long shadow beneath his cane. The trench coat he wore had seen better days, its fabric worn at the cuffs, it seems tired but pressed with care. He paused at the auxiliary service gate of Arlington National Cemetery. Two junior officers stepped forward, their posture rigid, brows stern beneath white-capped covers. "Invitation and ID, please, family and verified guests only," one said. "This is a general's funeral." Jack gave a small nod, his gaze unwavering but calm. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He stepped back without a word, leaning gently on the polished handle of his cane. The cemetery was silent except for the shuffling of honor guards lining up, their uniforms immaculate, their rifles gleaming in the light. Just beyond the gate, a mahogany casket draped in the American flag was being prepared for ceremonial honors. The trumpet's mournful cry had just begun when a tall figure in dress blues emerged from the line of generals, General Theodore Callahan, eyes searching the crowd, gloves in hand. "Where is Corporal Mercer?" he called, voice clear and sharp, echoing off the marble stones. The officers looked at one another, confused. "Bring him here," Callahan continued, removing his hat with deliberate slowness. "Now." A ripple of whispers moved through the assembled ranks. Callahan's voice cut through again, this time low and firm. "There are men who never stood in the spotlight but bore the cost, so the man in that flag-draped casket could come home." Jack looked up from beneath the brim of his hat. He straightened his spine, adjusted his grip on the cane, and stepped forward as the guards parted without another word. Asheville, North Carolina, sat nestled among the folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a town where time passed more slowly, more gently. It was here that Corporal Jonathan, Jack, Mercer had built his second life, quiet, clean, and mostly unseen. At 83, he still arrived each morning at Miller's garage just after sunrise, turning on the lights, brewing a pot of coffee no one ever finished, and waiting for someone to pull in with a busted alternator or stubborn engine light. He kept the garage spotless. His tools, most older than the kids who brought their cars in, hung in perfect order on the pegboard wall. He had no plaques on the walls, no medals on the shelves. There were no photos of jungle camps or brass reunions. The only item hinting at his past sat behind the counter, a small brass lighter etched with the words, "Iron Lance, 70. It rarely left his vest pocket. In 1970, Jack had led Bravo Team, 3rd Battalion, 82nd Airborne through the Vietnamese highlands in Operation Iron Lance, a mission officially recorded as a reconnaissance sweep but known to the men as something far darker. Swamps, snipers, and skies that never cleared. And somewhere in that hell, a young, freshly promoted Lieutenant Theodore Callahan had been dropped in as liaison. No field experience. No scars. No real chance. Jack saved him the first time less than an hour into the op. A misstep near a sunken trail, a hidden tripwire, and Jack's arm flung across Callahan's chest with enough force to bruise ribs. They stared at the camouflaged mine inches away. "You got a death wish, sir?" Jack had asked flatly, not expecting a reply. The second save came 2 nights later, during a heavy downpour. Artillery fell without pattern or pause. Theo froze, his leg bleeding badly after catching shrapnel near the kneecap. Jack crawled through 200 meters of mud and tracer fire to drag him behind a collapsed hut. He tore the man's pant leg open and applied a makeshift tourniquet, all while enemy silhouettes shifted in the trees. "You're gonna be okay," Jack had said, half out of breath. "But you freeze up again, and I'll kill you myself." The third time, Theo had charged ahead during a contact sweep, convinced a radio signal indicated friendlies nearby. He'd been wrong. Jack tackled him just before enemy fire erupted from the right flank. They huddled in the underbrush for 2 hours, counting breath between bursts of gunfire, the weight of silence heavier than any bullet. Theo learned. He began to listen more, bark less. And eventually, he watched Jack the way younger brothers do, always a few paces behind, observing, mimicking. By the fourth time Jack saved him, pulling him out of a collapsed tunnel during an ambush retreat, there were no more lectures. Just a nod and quiet thanks. But it was the fifth time that stayed with them both. A river ambush. Bravo team had just crossed a narrow rope bridge when gunfire erupted from behind and beneath. Jack, last across, caught sight of Theo falling from the ledge, his foot slipping on moss-slicked rock. Without thinking, Jack leapt in after him. The current was strong. The bullets louder. But Jack got to him, wrapped his arm around the man's chest and kicked until they reached the opposite bank, coughing and bloodied, but alive. The mission ended 2 weeks later, with only 6 of their original 17-man team still breathing. Debriefings were short. Medals were passed around like paper certificates. Theo was promoted. Jack declined an invite to Washington. He flew home, met his wife Lillian at the terminal, and never spoke of the jungle again. He never asked for favors. Never called in debts. But once a year, on the anniversary of Operation Iron Lance, he sent Theo a short letter, handwritten, usually just a few lines. Sometimes it was a quote from Lincoln, other times a simple, "Still here. Hope you are too." Theo always replied. Usually late. Usually typed. But the bond held. The last letter arrived 3 weeks ago. Thick paper. Envelope with the Department of the Army seal. Jack opened it slowly, expecting a typed memo. Instead, it was in Theo's handwriting. Jack, if you're reading this, I probably kicked the bucket. If not, then I've done something terribly dramatic and this will just be awkward. Jack chuckled once. Every time I thought about Arlington, I pictured brass bands and folded flags, but what I really thought about was you. The man who got me home 5 damn times. I wanted to make sure, if you ever came, that there was something waiting. Something real. There was no signature, just a line at the bottom. Without you, I'd have been a name on a wall. I owe you more than my life, I owe you whatever kind of man I became after. Jack read it 3 times. Then tucked it in the drawer beside his bed. He hadn't been invited to the funeral. No mention in the paper. No call from the Pentagon or any of Theo's aides. Just a folded letter from the dead and a name that wasn't listed on the guest manifest. Still, he polished his shoes the night before. Pressed his old coat. Packed his cane and rose before dawn. He walked 3 blocks in the dark to the station, bought a one-way ticket to D.C., and boarded the 5:45 a.m. bus out of Asheville. He sat alone, flag pin on his lapel, eyes half closed. As the mountains slipped away behind him, he folded his hands atop the cane and waited. He wasn't going for recognition. He was going to say goodbye. The bus rolled into Washington just after 11 a.m. The city had already begun to sweat under an early summer sun, and Jack felt the heat in his joints as he stepped off the Greyhound, his cane clacking lightly against the curb. He didn't pause for coffee or sit to rest. Instead, he walked the 4 blocks to the edge of Arlington, weaving through tourists and morning joggers. The cemetery gates, pristine white iron beneath solemn stone columns, looked like the entrance to a different world. In many ways, they were. Jack approached the auxiliary service gate. His steps were steady, even measured, despite the long ride and his years. The trench coat hung straight from his shoulders, pressed and proper. His tie, a faded regimental stripe, was cinched tightly at the neck. He carried nothing but a slim wallet and a folded program printout from the Army website. 2 guards in dress uniform stood at attention. Younger than his grandchildren, Jack thought. One raised a hand as Jack approached. "Sir, do you have your invitation and government-issued ID?" Jack pulled his wallet and presented his driver's license. "Name's Jonathan Mercer." "I'm not on the list, I know that." The guard scanned the ID, handed it back. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a restricted service, General Callahan's directives were clear." Family and verified personnel only. I understand, Jack said quietly, slipping the ID back into his coat. I won't cause trouble. He stepped aside without another word, settling near the base of a tall magnolia tree, its branches spilling shade across the trimmed grass. He adjusted the knot in his tie and leaned against the bark, just enough to ease the weight off his right leg. From there, he watched as the guests arrived. Black sedans with tinted windows. Men in suits, medals glittering beneath their lapels. Women in veils, clutching purses and tissues. A bishop in full collar. 2 senators. A retired Secretary of Defense. Even a face Jack recognized from the news, some cable host known for shouting. He watched it all with the same even expression he wore back in the jungle, unmoved, eyes narrowed just enough to see the details that mattered. At exactly noon, a polished black hearse pulled through the main gate, the flag-draped casket within catching sunlight through the glass. The honor guard stood at attention. Rifles gleamed. Buglers tightened their grips. A man in white gloves opened the rear door. The silence, sharp and total, seemed to swallow the city. Jack didn't resent being outside the fence. He'd served long enough to understand how protocol worked, how ranks and records shaped invitations. He didn't blame the young guards. He wasn't bitter. But as the casket was lifted and the procession began, something inside him twitched, something small and wordless. Not pride. Not envy. A sadness, maybe. Or the ghost of one. He had no expectations. Not then. Not ever. 30 yards away, inside the perimeter, Sergeant Emily Reyes stood stiffly in formation with the honor guard. Tall, sharp-featured, and meticulous, she'd graduated top of her class at the Defense Language Institute, then earned her post at Arlington after scoring nearly perfect in ceremonial drills. She took her duties seriously. Precision, discipline, order, these were the virtues she revered. But as the casket moved past, her eyes drifted to the man beneath the magnolia. She'd seen the insignia before. On his trench coat's left lapel sat a faded cloth patch, a broken paratrooper's wing crossed with a downward dagger. Not standard issue. Not common knowledge. But Emily had come across it once in an obscure archive, while researching commendation cases from declassified Vietnam-era records. The insignia had been stitched onto jackets belonging to unofficial recon units, groups sent in without backup, with mission scrubbed from existence if they failed. One name had stood out in those files, Corporal Jonathan Mercer. No photo. Just one line, handwritten by a long-retired commanding officer, only reason Callahan came home. She kept her gaze forward. Orders were orders. But during a brief repositioning drill, she stepped close to her squad leader and whispered, "Sir, I believe Corporal Mercer is here. He's just outside the south gate." The sergeant glanced at her, confused. "He's not on the list." "I know," Emily said carefully. "But he's here." The squad leader hesitated. "And how do you know who he is?" She tapped her temple once. "Academy records." Her voice held no pride, only certainty. The squad leader shifted. "Not our call. Protocol's tight." "Understood," she said. "But someone should know." Moments later, a whisper chain formed behind the ceremony, a brief, silent shuffle of information passed from officer to officer until it reached the inner circle of the funeral committee. From there, it moved to the protocol liaison. Then to the assistant adjutant. And finally, as the bugler raised his instrument for the final salute, the quiet message reached General Callahan's son. The young man leaned in and murmured into the ear of the man standing near the podium. General Callahan's brother. He blinked once, then turned slowly. Callahan had no other siblings. No surviving uncles. No close cousins. Only a widow in a black veil and a long line of dignitaries who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But now, the inner circle paused. The bugle held. Under the tree, Jack straightened when the music stopped. He caught the subtle shift in posture from the honor guard, heads turning, eyes scanning. Then he heard the words, clear across the lawn. "Where is Corporal Jonathan Mercer?" It was a man's voice, not barked, not whispered. Carried by microphone, it rose into the air like smoke. Jack didn't move right away. He wasn't sure he'd heard it. Then it came again, stronger. "Bring him here." The guards at the auxiliary gate hesitated. Then, with practiced fluidity, one stepped back and pulled the latch. The gate creaked open. Jack looked up at the trees. Then forward. He took a breath, tucked the brim of his hat down slightly, and stepped through. No one stopped him. No one questioned his name or rank. The casket waited in silence. The sun burned clean overhead. And as he walked onto the sacred lawn, with his cane tapping softly at his side, every eye turned, not in judgment, not in curiosity, but in something older. Something deeper. Recognition. The silence was profound, heavier than any gun salute. As Jack crossed the threshold onto Arlington's sacred lawn, it was as if time contracted. His cane tapped the earth softly, but each sound echoed like a bell. Officers stepped aside, not with hesitation, but reverence. No one saluted him. That was not the custom for an enlisted man. But they watched, upright, hands behind backs, expressions unreadable. Sergeant Emily Reyes stood at attention among the honor guard. Her eyes didn't waver, but inside, her heart beat faster than parade cadence. She had only glimpsed the old soldier before, under the tree, a lone figure who seemed carved from a different era. Now, walking onto the field, his presence distorted everything she'd learned about hierarchy. There was no rank strong enough to contain the quiet force of him. The ceremonial bugler, poised for the final call, froze mid-motion. Protocol officers exchanged glances. One of them, Major Sinclair, stepped forward, whispering something to a colonel with polished ribbons down his chest. The colonel gave a tight nod and turned to the podium, where General Callahan's brother waited. They were stalling. Not delaying, preparing. Jack didn't rush. His steps were slow, deliberate, measured not in effort but in memory. As he reached the paved approach to the casket, he paused. The flag was immaculate, red, white, and blue stretched taut, the folds precise, stars aligned. It floated atop the casket like something sacred. General Callahan's widow stood a few feet away, small and composed, her black veil stirring in the wind. She watched Jack without recognition. But something flickered in her, perhaps a memory Theo had once spoken softly by the fire, or a name she'd read at the bottom of a letter she'd never understood. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply inclined her head. Jack returned the gesture, brief, solemn. At the front of the gathering, just past the wreaths and riflemen, General Thomas Callahan stepped forward. Older than Jack by perhaps a few years, but looking older still, the general wore full-dress uniform. Medals glittered across his chest, none more than the Distinguished Service Cross, a decoration Jack had once seen handed to a man who'd done far less. Callahan's gloved hand trembled slightly as he removed his cover. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But his voice, when it came, was stripped of ceremony. "Corporal Mercer," he said. "Thank you for coming." Jack nodded. "Sir. You don't owe me that anymore," Callahan said gently. Jack held his gaze. "Doesn't matter. Some habits aren't ours to break." A ripple of tension passed through the guests. A general being addressed like that by a corporal was unheard of. But no one interrupted. Something deeper than protocol held them back. Callahan turned to the assembled officers. "Many of you know my brother," he began. "You served with him. Or under him. You knew him as a strategist, a decorated commander, and a statesman. He paused, his jaw tight. But what you don't know, what wasn't written in the citation, is that he once followed another man into 5 different hells. And survived each time because that man refused to let him die. Jack stood unmoving. A statue of discipline. I was there for the paperwork, Callahan continued. The accolades. The promotions. But Corporal Mercer, his voice cracked. He was there for the blood. He turned to Jack now, stepping down from the podium. There were things my brother wanted done if he didn't make it. Letters. Flags. Honors. He reached into his uniform pocket and removed a small, velvet box. Jack flinched. I don't need that. Callahan stopped. I know. I didn't come for that. I know, Callahan said again. He opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a tarnished bronze star, its surface dulled by time, its inscription faint but legible. Corporal J. Mercer, Iron Lance, 1970. Jack stared at it. His fingers twitched, then closed into a loose fist. I asked him why he never gave it to you, Callahan said softly. He told me medals were for men who needed reminding. Said you'd never needed one. Jack breathed slowly, once. Then why now, he asked. Callahan looked down at the star. Because it's not for you anymore. It's for them. He turned and gestured toward the watching officers, the young honor guard, the aides children, the stone-eyed colonels and civilians in black. They need to see it, Callahan said. They need to remember. Jack stared at the star, then at the faces in the crowd. He didn't recognize any of them. But their expressions were raw, confused, reverent, wide-eyed. He took the box, held it in his palm, and stared down at it. The metal reflected no light. It was not a gleam, but a weight. He turned to the widow. She stepped forward and held something wrapped in navy cloth. Theo arranged this, she said quietly. He left instructions, just in case you came. She unfolded the cloth to reveal the funeral flag, meticulously folded, white trim showing in every crease. Jack looked at her, eyes wet but hard. I shouldn't. You should, she said, placing it in his arms. He cradled it instinctively, like it was something fragile. He looked down at the star again, and for the first time, his hand trembled. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately, and began to walk away from the ceremony. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. As he passed Sergeant Reyes, she snapped a salute, not for his rank, but for the life he carried in silence. Jack hesitated. He returned it. Not with a standard palm in salute, but a quiet tap of 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, old school. Airborne. The kind you only gave to those who'd earned it in the dirt. Behind him, the bugler raised his horn again. This time, the call was not interrupted. It rang clean and full, drifting over the graves, the trees, the marble and silence. A song for the living. A farewell for the dead. The final note of the bugle dissolved into silence, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Jack paused just beyond the ceremonial lawn, his cane planted firmly in the earth, the folded flag tucked securely under one arm, the bronze star still cradled in his other hand. His eyes scanned the neat rows of headstones stretching endlessly into the horizon, white teeth in the green jaw of the land. Behind him, the service slowly resumed. General Callahan's brother returned to the podium, but the energy had shifted. No longer just a state affair, no longer merely a gathering of dignitaries and military brass. Now it was something more human. The ceremony had gained a spine. Jack stood in that liminal space, half remembered, half erased. A young lieutenant approached him, nervous but trying not to show it. Sir, Corporal Mercer, General Callahan would like to speak with you again, if you have a moment. Jack looked down at the ground before lifting his gaze. Ain't much I haven't heard before. The lieutenant fumbled. I think it's more for us now, sir. Jack nodded, his voice dry. That's usually how it goes. He followed the lieutenant back toward the casket. The honor guard had broken ranks to form a column, clearing a path for him. Jack walked slowly, not out of frailty, but reverence. A few guests turned to watch, others whispered. The younger officers seemed especially affected, their eyes lingering on the modest patch on Jack's coat more than the medals on his chest. When he reached the front, General Thomas Callahan stood waiting with one hand behind his back. The other held a framed document. His eyes, reddened at the edges, did not blink. Jack, he said simply. My brother wrote one final request. I'd like to honor it. Jack tilted his head. That what all this is? Callahan gestured toward the crowd. That, and something else. He stepped aside, revealing a narrow granite bench near the memorial wall, newly installed, its edges still marked by faint lines of adhesive tape not yet peeled away. Upon it, a bronze plaque glinted in the sun. Jack squinted. It read, "Reserved for the quiet kind. Here, honor lives." Jack said nothing. He simply looked at it. The words didn't stir pride or triumph. They stirred something deeper, an ache that had no name. An ache that had grown with each year of silence. Callahan cleared his throat. The Army doesn't often allow unofficial memorials inside Arlington. But my brother, he wouldn't let go of this one. Jack glanced sideways. You pulled some strings. I broke some. They stood there a while in mutual stillness. A moment too heavy for applause, too solemn for thanks. Finally, Jack turned toward the crowd. He raised the velvet box containing the bronze star slightly, like a quiet offering, then tucked it back inside his coat pocket. A few soldiers straightened instinctively. Somewhere near the back, a young cadet pressed his fist to his heart. Jack addressed no one in particular. Courage don't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up. Stays put. Waits. He gave the folded flag one final glance, then stepped toward the bench and gently laid it down. The cloth rested against the stone like it belonged there. General Callahan's widow approached again. Do you remember what Theo said, that first day he got back from Iron Lance? Jack smirked faintly. I remember what he didn't say. She smiled. He said you weren't just a soldier. He said you were a living compass. The kind of man people navigate by, whether they know it or not. Jack looked away, his eyes clouding. She stepped forward and placed her hand briefly on his arm. He never forgot. Even if he rarely spoke of it. Jack whispered, that was the deal. I'd do the saving. He'd do the talking. She nodded once and stepped back. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, officers and enlisted alike broke formation and approached him, not in fanfare, but humility. A young Army nurse offered a nod and handed him a white carnation. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted with trembling fingers. Even a brigadier general bowed his head and said, "Welcome home, Corporal." Jack didn't answer most of them. He didn't need to. But when a boy, no more than 10, stepped forward holding his father's hand, a father in full dress blues, Jack knelt slightly, lowering himself despite the stiffness in his knees. You were really in a war? The boy asked, wide-eyed. Jack looked at him carefully, then nodded. Still am. Just quieter now. The boy thought about that, then extended his hand. Jack shook it gently, like sealing something sacred. Later, as the crowds thinned and only the honor guard remained to fold the final chairs, Jack sat quietly on the new granite bench. The bronze plaque glinted beside him. The cane leaned against his leg. The velvet box rested on his lap. Sergeant Emily Reyes approached from behind. "Corporal Mercer," she said, her voice more breath than sound. He didn't turn. "Ma'am? You taught us more today than a dozen briefings ever could." Jack let the silence answer for a while. Then he said, "Don't let the ceremony distract you from the soul. Real honor lives in silence." She straightened and saluted. He returned it with the same quiet tap of fingers to hat brim as before. As she walked away, Jack leaned forward, fingers gently tracing the edge of the plaque. "Reserved for the quiet kind." He thought about the phrase. About Theo. About Bravo Team. About the ones who didn't get flags or folded programs or bronze stars in velvet boxes. Then he stood, slowly but surely. He took the folded flag in both hands, returned it to the keepsake box one of the aides had provided. He slipped the bronze star inside his breast pocket and buttoned it shut. He turned once more to the field, now empty save for stone markers and sunlight. He breathed in the scent of grass, flowers, and memory. And then he walked away. The following day, a quiet fog clung to the valleys of Asheville as Jack stepped off the morning bus, cane in hand, coat buttoned to the neck. The ride home had been uneventful. No tributes, no handshakes. Just the hum of tires on asphalt and a folded flag in a wooden box resting on his lap. He made his way back to the small two-bedroom home he'd shared with Lillian until she passed in '09. The curtains were drawn. The porch creaked with familiar rhythm beneath his feet. He placed the box gently on the hallway table beside the old rotary phone and a jar of keys. Above them hung a photo of their wedding day, he in uniform, she in a polka-dot dress, both smiling as if time couldn't touch them. The bronze star remained in his coat pocket. He didn't take it out. Not yet. In the garage, Jack flipped the sign from closed to open. The ritual grounded him. Miller's garage was still his place, even if the world had mostly forgotten it. Even if customers were now few and far between. He swept the floor, oiled the bench vise, tightened a loose bolt on the air compressor, then sat on the old stool by the wall, just beneath a bulletin board lined with spare keys and yellowing invoices. From his coat, he finally withdrew the velvet box and opened it. The bronze star sat heavy in his palm. He didn't stare at it long. Instead, he stood, reached for the pegboard, and tacked the open case into the top corner. It hung crooked. He didn't adjust it. At noon, a young woman pushed through the front door, curly hair, backpack slung over one shoulder, keys jangling in hand. It was Claire, his neighbor's daughter. Her car had been stalling for weeks. "Mr. Mercer," she said with a warm grin, "it finally died on me." He gave a soft grunt. "Park it out back. I'll take a look." She hesitated, noticing the metal. "Is that yours?" Jack followed her gaze. "Not really. It's for someone else." She looked confused but nodded, sensing he wouldn't elaborate. That afternoon, Jack replaced her battery, cleaned the fuel line, and even vacuumed the floor mats without being asked. When she tried to pay, he shook his head. "Someone helped me get where I am," he said simply. "Just returning the favor." Claire lingered for a moment before leaving. She'd always known Mr. Mercer was a veteran. Everyone in the neighborhood did. But something had shifted. It wasn't just the metal on the wall. It was the weight he now seemed to carry with peace instead of burden. Word began to spread quietly. Not headlines. Not interviews. But something slower, more organic. It started with a photo. Emily Reyes had snapped it with discretion during the Arlington service, a wide shot of Jack standing beside the new bench, the plaque gleaming behind him. She didn't post it online. Instead, she shared it with her academy instructor and wrote a short memo explaining the significance. Her professor forwarded it to a military ethics committee. A week later, it reached a Pentagon aide. Within days, It found its way into the internal training modules of select Army leadership schools under a lesson titled, Quiet Valor, Legacy Beyond Rank. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about combat. It was about integrity. One of the generals who'd attended Theo Callahan's funeral ordered a full review of Operation Iron Lance. Jack's name appeared 6 times in redacted field reports, each time buried under layers of chain-of-command filtering. The review didn't rewrite history, but it clarified it. A commendation was refiled. A citation updated. No fanfare. Just small corrections to truth. Back in Asheville, Jack received a certified letter. Not from the Army, but from a nonprofit called Echo Flag, a group that traced legacy veterans and documented their stories for future generations. They requested an interview. Jack declined. But he did write them a letter, handwritten, as always. Some things are better remembered quietly. Tell them to look at the bench if they want to know who I was. That fall, a group of cadets from Fort Bragg visited Arlington as part of their leadership seminar. One of them, Cadet Miles Jensen, wandered off during the walking tour and found the granite bench tucked near the edge of the ceremonial quadrant. He sat there for 20 minutes, reading the plaque over and over. When the group reassembled, he asked the instructor, "Who's it for?" The instructor replied, "A man who saved a general but never asked to be remembered." Miles didn't forget the story. Years later, as a company commander in Afghanistan, he carried a small laminated copy of the plaque's inscription in his helmet liner. Back home, Jack's days followed familiar rhythms. Coffee at dawn. Garage by 7. Fix what could be fixed. Listen more than he spoke. He still wore the coat most days. The Bronze Star remained pinned inside the pocket, hidden, but there. Occasionally, a stranger would stop by. A soldier's daughter asking for directions. A retired chaplain looking for a tire rotation. A delivery driver who took a photo of the medal and shook his hand without saying why. Jack never sought out their recognition. But they left lighter than they arrived. One crisp morning, Claire returned with a tray of pastries. She found Jack sitting in the sun outside the garage, cane resting beside him, eyes closed under his cap. She was about to speak when she noticed something strange. The flag case sat on the table beside him, open. The cloth inside had been unfolded. Jack opened one eye. "Morning," he rasped. Claire pointed. "You opened it?" "Thought it could use some air," he replied, then nodded toward the wooden crate beneath the table. "There's another in there. You mind taking it up to the Veterans Hall?" She blinked. "Another what?" "Another flag. Belonged to someone I knew. One who didn't make it back." Claire crouched, lifting the crate. Inside was a folded flag, pressed flat as stone. No name. No marker. Just reverence. "You want me to tell them it's from you?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "Tell them it's from someone who was never asked." She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. As she walked away, Jack reached into his coat and removed the Bronze Star. He looked at it for a long time, the sun dancing on its edges. Then he set it down on the table, beside the open flag case. He didn't need to carry it anymore. The weight had finally passed. That night, as the moonlight pooled across the wooden porch, Jack sat by the open window, a small radio murmuring in the background. Somewhere on the breeze, laughter echoed from 2 houses down, children playing long after bedtime. He let it wash over him. He didn't speak, didn't move. But his eyes, wet and silent, said everything. Not sorrow. Not pride. Peace. Honor endures.